Battle of Crecy, the untold story of Crecy. How did a blind king ride into battle tied to his knights, knowing he would never see the enemy? Why did a teenage prince fight off seasoned warriors while his father watched from a windmill? And what made the French elite charge headlong into a storm of arrows, only to be trampled by their own allies? Once upon a time, specifically the early 1340s, King Edward III of England, a man with a crown too heavy and a mother too French, decided he had a bone to pick with Philip VI of France. You see, Edward had a claim to the French throne through his mother, Isabella, daughter of Philip IV, and like any good medieval monarch, he thought, why not settle this with a century of war? But Edward wasn't just a crown chaser. He was also a wine connoisseur with a treasury problem. His beloved Gascony, nestled in southwestern France, was the jewel of his realm, not because of its scenic vineyards, but because it shipped 80,000 tons of wine a year. That's not a typo. That's a medieval river of Merlot. And the taxes from this wine trade? They made London look like a lemonade stand. Unfortunately, the French had a habit of nibbling at Gascony like rats at a feast, and Edward wasn't having it. So he launched a three-pronged invasion: the Earl of Northampton into Brittany, Edward himself into northern France, and the Earl of Derby, Henry of Lancaster, into Gascony, a man so talented he made war look like a well-rehearsed ballet. Derby's campaign was a masterclass in medieval mayhem. After replacing the uninspiring Nicholas Beche with Ralph Stafford, Derby set sail, only to be delayed by winds that clearly had French sympathies. Meanwhile, the Gascons were already poking the French bear, besieging Blaye and Langon. Derby finally landed on August 9th, 1345, and decided to skip the warm-up. He stormed Bergerac, caught the French mid-siege, and slaughtered them so thoroughly they probably considered switching careers to winemaking. Next, he marched on Périgueux, but the garrison was too beefy. So he blockaded it, only to be chased off by Louis of Poitiers. The French thought they'd won, until Derby caught them at dinner at Auberoche on October 21st and turned their stew into a bloodbath. The castle garrison attacked from the rear, and Louis's army was broken like a cheap goblet. The Duke of Normandy, John, had no stomach for this. He disbanded his army and fled north, leaving Derby to sip Gascon wine in peace until March 1346. Meanwhile, Edward was preparing his own invasion. Morally and contractually obliged to help Gascony, he assembled an army of 10,000 to 15,000 men at Portsmouth. But where would he strike? Even his own commanders didn't know. On June 20th, he revealed his true plan: Normandy, not Gascony. A bold move, considering Philip expected an attack elsewhere. The Cotentin Peninsula was the target, and Edward landed there in July 1346, torching towns, looting wine cellars, and marching within sniffing distance of Paris. Philip, now thoroughly annoyed, gathered the largest army in Europe and chased Edward north. The English, hoping to link up with Flemish allies, turned toward Crécy-en-Ponthieu, where they dug in on a low ridge and waited. Now pause for a sec. Join the front lines of history and power. Welcome to European battle, where epic clashes, legendary warriors, and untold stories come alive. By subscribing and turning on notifications, you're not just joining a channel, you're stepping into a world of thrilling battles. From ancient empires to modern warfare, we deliver cinematic storytelling, expert insights, and exclusive content that will leave you breathless. Don't just watch history, live it. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a moment of the action. European battle, where legends clash. It was 11th July 1346, and the English king, Edward III, finally boarded his ship at Portsmouth. The wind was brisk, the sea was moody, and the king's mood? Somewhere between, let's conquer France and I hope the wine holds out. Before sunrise on the 12th, the English fleet reached the Cotentin Peninsula, Normandy's northern coast, a place that would soon regret ever being on a map. By 18th July, Edward's army was fully ashore, and what followed was not so much a march as a scorched earth ballet, an orbit of destruction. 35 kilometers wide, spread like wildfire. Villages burned, barns emptied, and terrified peasants fled into the woods or southward, clutching goats, children, and whatever dignity they had left. Edward had declared quite nobly that no life or property should be taken. His soldiers responded with the medieval equivalent of, "Sure, Jan." The Norman countryside was ravaged, and 200 ships from the original fleet traced the coastline, seizing or sinking anything that floated and didn't fly an English flag. By 24th July, the English army had Caen in its sights, the largest Norman city west of Rouen, nestled along the Orne River, which was supposed to be a natural barrier. The French constable Raoul II of Brienne, a man with more courage than luck, gathered every available man to defend the city, hoping to stall Edward long enough for Philip VI to muster a proper army. Caen was divided into two parts. Old Town, surrounded by crumbling walls that looked like they'd been patched by blind masons. New Town, surrounded by water and actually defensible, which is where Raoul and his 4,000 defenders huddled with the citizens. On the 26th July, Edward's army overran two walled abbeys that were inexplicably undefended. Perhaps the monks were praying for a miracle. They then stormed Old Town, discovering that Raoul had concentrated his forces to the south. The castle in the north still held firm, and a line of French ships blocked the passage between the Odon River and the island entrance at Port Saint-Pierre. But the river was low, thanks to the summer heat, and Edward's Welsh spearmen and longbowmen waded across like it was a picnic in the mud. Despite crossbow fire, the English broke through the ship blockade, set two ships ablaze, and attacked the defenders at the bridge from behind. What followed was a butchery. 2,500 citizens of Caen were slain. Raoul and others fled to the towers, only to be captured later. Edward remained in Caen for 5 days, his army devastating the countryside like locusts with swords. Then he turned his gaze toward Paris. Edward halted at Lisieux while Philip VI was still assembling his army at Saint-Denis. Papal emissaries tried to broker peace, but Edward treated them like door-to-door salesmen and pressed on to Rouen. The city was occupied, the bridge broken, and so the English army snaked along the Seine, shadowed by Philip like a jealous ex. By 12th August, Edward was dangerously close to Paris, and the citizens were in full panic mode, probably hiding their wine and praying to every saint they could name. Philip moved to the capital, while Edward crossed the Seine at Poissy, having rebuilt the bridge like a medieval Bob the Builder. Then came the masterstroke. Philip sent a formal challenge to battle, specifying a location south of the river. Edward, ever the chess player, sent a raiding party toward Chartres, making Philip believe he'd accepted. Philip marched 4 miles south, ready to crush his enemy. Instead, Edward ran for it, a royal sprint that left Philip feeling like he'd been stood up at a jousting match. Philip pursued with impressive speed, 25 miles per day, while Edward's army lagged, slowed by pillaging, skirmishes, and the occasional wagon abandonment. The French had cut off supplies, forcing Edward to send foraging parties just to keep his men fed. Philip reached the Somme River first. Edward was at Irènes, Philip at Amiens, and the French had either destroyed or garrisoned every bridge. Edward had two options: fight where he stood, bad idea. Take ship at St. Valery, also bad idea. Instead, he pressed toward the ford at Blanchetaque, arriving before dawn. The tide was up, and the English waited tensely as Godemar du Fay lined up 3,500 men on the far bank. At the front were 500 men-at-arms, backed by crossbowmen who unleashed a storm of bolts. The English longbowmen returned fire, and the men-at-arms charged to hold a beachhead. As more English poured in, Godemar faltered and fled to Abbeville, chased all the way to the gates. Philip, hoping to trap Edward between the river and the coast, was too late. His vanguard under John of Bohemia seized some wagons, but Edward's rearguard completed the crossing in an hour, and the rising tide blocked pursuit. With no hope of linking up with Sir Hugh Hastings, whose Flemish allies had dispersed, Edward turned toward high ground near the village of Crécy. He chose his ground like a seasoned general, a gentle ridge between Crecy and Wadicourt, May River to the front, forest to the south, a fortified camp for wounded and arrow storage. Edward's army was dismounted, spread across the ridge. On the right, the Black Prince, just 16, commanded men-at-arms and longbowmen, possibly with field guns. On the left, the Earls of Northampton and Arundel held their ground. Edward himself was in reserve, near a raised windmill, surveying the field like a hawk with a crown. His army numbered around 15,000, while Philip's force was much larger. 12,000 mounted men-at-arms, 6,000 Genoese crossbowmen, and an innumerable horde of infantry trailing behind. Philip was advised to march north and rest, but instead he chose to attack, with tired troops, scattered formations, and a battle-ready English army waiting on the ridge. And so, the stage was set. The arrows were stacked, the longbows were strung. The fate of kings and kingdoms hung in the balance. At first, King Philip VI of France had agreed to postpone hostilities. Perhaps he hoped for a more elegant solution, a diplomatic dance, a strategic delay. But who was he kidding? His army was a powder keg of overeager men-at-arms, noble egos, and horses that hadn't eaten in days. The memory of Bouvines in 1340, where a stalemate had left France red-faced, still haunted him. Another such embarrassment? Unthinkable. And then there was Charles, Count of Alençon, Philip's younger brother, and a man who made rashness look like a virtue. He insisted he would attack the English as soon as he could see them. Philip, realizing his leash had snapped, decided to unleash the dogs of war, starting with the Genoese crossbowmen, the most disciplined troops he had. Philip's battle plan, if one could call it that, was a three-layered cake of chaos. Front line, Genoese crossbowmen, meant to soften up the English. Middle line, cavalry under Alençon, including the crème de la crème of French nobility. Rear line, Philip himself, commanding the rest of the mounted men-at-arms. In theory, it was organized. In reality, it was a stampede of fury, a collective tantrum of the French elite determined to make the English pay for every stolen chicken and burned barn. Meanwhile, the English were waking up like it was a Sunday morning. Their position was strong, their morale high, and their king had ordered thousands of potholes dug to trip up the French cavalry. Medieval landmines, if you will. The Genoese were ordered forward, but their shields were still stuck with the baggage train. Then, as if the heavens themselves sided with Edward, a storm broke out. The ground turned to soup, and the crossbow strings were soaked, rendering their shots weak and pitiful. The English longbowmen, however, simply unstrung their bows, tucked them under their helmets, and waited. When the skies cleared and the Genoese were in range, they let fly. Arrows rained down like divine punishment. The Genoese, blinded by the sun and outgunned, broke ranks and ran. Enter Alençon, stage left, foaming with rage. Seeing the Genoese retreat, he bellowed, "Ride down this rabble who block our advance." And so, the French cavalry charged through their own allies, trampling mercenaries and morale alike. The ground was churned, the potholes did their work, and the longbowmen turned the sky black with arrows. Horses fell, legs snapped, knights were thrown like rag dolls. Only a handful of the 4,000 cavalry made it to the English lines, and were promptly cut down. Among the dead, Count Alençon, whose bravado had finally met its match. Philip had raised the Oriflamme, the sacred banner of no mercy. Edward responded in kind. No captives. Not out of cruelty, but because he simply didn't have the manpower to babysit prisoners. Then came one of the most tragic and noble moments of the battle. John of Bohemia, blind but unbowed, had two knights tie their horses' bridles to his. He charged at the head of 2,000 Czech men-at-arms, determined to strike one last blow. They smashed into the Black Prince's line, and for a moment, chaos reigned. The young Edward, just 16, was pressed hard. Chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker wrote, "The young prince displayed marvelous courage, running through horses, felling knights, crushing helmets under his blows." A knight rushed to King Edward, begging for reinforcements. The king asked if his son was dead. "No." Then came the famous reply, "Let the boy win his spurs. I wish the day to be his." The prince's banner fell, either torn away or dropped in the melee. But Sir Thomas Daniel recovered it, and reinforcements arrived to find the prince still fighting, bloodied but unbroken. As the field turned into a graveyard of men and horses, King Philip himself entered the fray. He fought bravely, had 2 horses killed under him, and took an arrow to the throat or face. But it was hopeless. As darkness crept in, John of Hainault and Philip's retainers dragged the reluctant king from the field. The remaining French forces were too broken to mount another charge. The ground was so littered with corpses that even a retreat was a challenge. The next morning, Edward and his son surveyed the dead. Among them lay John of Bohemia, the blind king. The Black Prince, moved by his courage, adopted the ostrich feather badge, a symbol still worn by the princes of Wales today. With the French army shattered, Edward could now march north at his leisure. Crecy was a blinding success, but Edward wasn't done. He turned toward Boulogne and then set his sights on the fortress of Calais, a siege that would last for months and change the course of the war. Next up, the Battle of Poitiers, where the Black Prince returns and the stakes get even higher. Stay tuned. If you enjoyed this tale of kings, chaos, and courage, don't forget to follow us, subscribe. Click the notification bell so you never miss another epic chapter in our journey through history.